Hello and welcome to the oddschecker betting show. This is a very special episode sponsored by Parimatch as we look ahead to the massive heavyweight clash between Tyson Fury and Dillian Whyte with the WC title on the line. I'm your host George Elek and I'm joined by two very special guests today, including former doubleweight world champion Carl Frampton and our resident boxing expert Josh Wright as well. Carl, it must be exciting going into such a massive fight like this. I know you're pretty busy in terms of previews. Do occasions like this make you miss being in the ring yourself?
No, not really. But I'm really happy and excited about the whole. It's kind of the first. I've been working for BT for quite a while now, but this is the first kind of big fight week I've been able to work on. So I'm looking forward to that. I think a big stadium fight is good. Everybody loves a stadium fight. And I think it's going to be a good fight as well.
Fingers crossed. I know you were up early this morning to get a flight over, so I hope you're full of coffee ready for this preview now. And Josh, tell us a bit about how you got into boxing and what it is about the sport that you love.
Well, I think I might be the only person ever to say this, but it was actually Andre Ward versus Paul Smith in 2015 that got me into boxing. A friend of mine told me about Andre Ward a month or so about before the fight, about his comeback trail, his legal problems that he was having, his Olympic pedigree. And from that point, I was all in. I remember I was fortunate enough. I got to meet him a couple of years ago, spend a few hours with him with a gym in London. And one of the first things I noticed was just how big his fists were. We had a photo afterwards, and I remember looking at the photo afterwards and thinking that he'd made my wrist look like a 13-year-old boy's, which they probably still do, to be fair. But yeah, I can get that photo out if we want to put it on screen for the people to see. But yeah, it was Andre Ward was my route into boxing.
Amazing. I thought it was a bit of an open goal that you could say it was Carl who got you into boxing, but I'll say that instead. Before we get into the analysis, let me tell you about our sponsors. Parimatch's very special sign-up offer for new customers ahead of the fight. They're offering 30 to 1 for Tyson Fury to win, or you can opt for Dillian Whyte to win at 70 to 1. As always, you must be 18 plus, be gamble aware, and always do gamble responsibly. These enhanced odds will be paid in free bets with a max stake of £1, but £1 on a 5-on shot at 30 to 1 isn't something to sniff at all. Let's get into the preview then and looking ahead at the fight itself. And when you're looking ahead at this fight as a pundit, Carl, obviously you're approaching it differently as you would to a fighter or as a fan. What kind of things are you looking at in terms of previewing the fight and how it's going to go and the way that this fight is going to unfold in the ring?
Well, you're looking at the styles of the fighters and what they've done typically before and how they normally approach fights. I think when we look at Dillian Whyte, we know what they expect, and that is kind of gung-ho, and he's wild at times, but he's always brave. He's always in a fight because he can punch and he's got a really good left hook. And when we look at Tyson Fury, before the Wilder fights, we'd have thought, he's a nice mover, a guy who gets up on his toes for a massive, monstrous man, and he moves really well. But in the Wilder fight, we've seen a different side to him. We've seen a kind of seek and destroy style, which we haven't seen before, and we didn't really know if he had that in him. But he showed a lot of people that he did have it. So going into this fight, you would typically expect Whyte to come forward, be aggressive, Fury to get up on his toes and move around. But it may not be the case because of what we've seen Fury do in the Wilder fight. I think it's once the fight was made, I had a winner in my head, and I've stuck with that. And I don't normally do that. Normally I change my mind throughout the build-up to the fight, but it's always been one man. It's always been Tyson Fury, and I feel like if you're going to build a fighter that Tyson Fury looks good against, you build someone similar to Dillian Whyte. And that's why I feel like he wins the fight. But Whyte is always in it because he's got that dangerous left hook.
But is there an argument to say that, given what Fury's done against Wilder 3 times effectively, even though the first ended, of course, in a draw, is this a case of you're fighting a bit of a Wilder light in terms of Whyte, and that's why Fury should be able to approach the fight in the same way and go gung-ho?
No, I think that would be a bit disrespectful to Dillian Whyte. I think that Wilder isn't that good. He's a monstrous puncher, but he wasn't a very good boxer. I saw him. I was in Vegas watching Leo Santa Cruz on a Wilder Ortiz undercard, and he'd lost every minute of every round up until he knocked him out. But he's got serious power, probably the biggest punch in heavyweight that there's ever been. But he's not a very good boxer. Dillian Whyte can punch, not as hard as Wilder, but he's a bit more about him than Wilder in terms of boxing IQ. And he's brave as well. And saying that, Wilder was brave too, but I think to call him kind of a Wilder light would be a fair bit disrespectful.
I hope Dillian doesn't see me saying that and come after me anyway. But you know, we heard there, Josh, we heard Carl there kind of talking about the way that the Fury is now fighting and changing. For those who don't know about his relationship with Sugar Hill Stewart as well, can you explain what it is that is changing about the way that he's approaching these fights?
I think the relationship with Sugar Hill is perfect in many ways because I think they really complement each other in and out of the ring. You see them in and around fight week. They seem to have pretty similar characters and how they carry themselves. It seems to be more than just a professional relationship. But I think the difference, as Carl said earlier, we used to see Fury on the back foot punching as he moved, which sort of probably took away quite a lot of the power. But now he's planting his feet, he's landing the 1-2-3 punch combinations and then moving back out the pocket. I think that's what one of Wilder's biggest mistakes was, that he allowed Fury to plant his feet and throw his punches hard without disrupting his flow. And I think that's what Dillian Whyte really needs to do. He needs to, what Dillian Whyte has that Deontay Wilder didn't use was a jab. I think it was the third fight, wasn't it? The first round. Yeah. That was the first time we saw Deontay Wilder throw a meaningful jab, and that went out the window pretty sharpish. I think he didn't land a jab in 4 of the last 5 rounds of the third fight, whereas Dillian Whyte has a really strong jab, and if he wants to close that distance, he needs to not do it recklessly, but use his jab to close the distance. And I think that could be key for Dillian Whyte, because as Carl said, he's got a really dangerous left hook, but he needs to make opportunities for that to happen, and he can't just storm in.
Yeah, we've heard there, Josh saying how he thinks Dillian Whyte can beat Tyson Fury. You've said yourself you think Fury's going to win. If you were in the Whyte camp, what would you be saying is the blueprint to try and get into this fight with the odds? Let's face it, massively stacked against Whyte.
Well, I think that it needs to be a shootout. Like, it needs to be a firefight, and I think if Fury gets up on his toes, it makes it really difficult for Dillian Whyte. A lot of times we see Dillian Whyte, when he throws his left hook, it's kind of he catches it and then he throws it. I think if he starts to maybe throw with Fury as well, so as Fury's punching, throw at the same time, he may have a little bit of success with that. But I think that he has to drag him into a fight. I can't remember. I was speaking to someone recently, and I can't remember who it was, but they made a really good point, and I don't want to steal their point on him, but I just don't remember who it was. May have been Chris Lloyd. Can't remember. But it was about Fury. Maybe we didn't see the fights in the last 2 fights against Wilder. We didn't see him get up on his toes. Maybe he's not able to do that anymore because of how he lived. He ballooned up in weight because of what's happened to him in the past, and the drink and the drugs and everything else. And it takes its toll on your body. So maybe he's having to stand now because he just doesn't have the mobility to move around the ring. And he's a big guy. Like, it defies logic that he was actually able to do that at one point. He may still be able to do it, but it may be a point of him just having to stand there because he has to do it now. He doesn't have that mobility. But I think that gives Dillian Whyte more of an opportunity to win the fight if it is fought in close quarters. But what Fury done to Wilder also suggests then that Fury will be good enough to fight up close and to win the fight. But I think that's where Dillian has his best chance of winning.
Do you agree with that as well, Josh? Do you think that's where you would look to hope the weakness is for Fury?
For sure. I think, as Carl said, Dillian Whyte needs to get in range because there's such a big height difference and weight difference. I think if we're going back on Dillian Whyte's last 10 fights, back to the first Chisora fight, which you'd say is probably the peak of his career, he's really coming around 250 pounds. And if Fury comes in anything close to what he did for Wilder for the last 2 fights, which is 275 to 280, I think, then that's like a 30 pound weight difference. And I think he can't afford to let Fury punch at full extension, full rotation, because that's when obviously the punches are going to be at their most dangerous. So for him, it's all about closing that distance, but not doing it recklessly.
Going back to the kind of change in style from Fury, Carl, as well. We think of him, as you say, as a boxer who'd move around, become a lot more aggressive in the fights against Wilder. How difficult is that to do? I mean, looking in from the outside, as someone who doesn't box, to shift your strategy so much and still achieve such great heights seems crazy. So how difficult would that have been to change his mindset?
I think it would be really difficult. If you've got one style that you're known for, to completely change that, it's got to be hard to do. We've seen fighters do it in the past, but I'm talking about great fighters doing it. We've seen Bernard Hopkins do it towards the end of his career. and change his style. We've seen Floyd Mayweather do it too. The first part of his career was a more exciting fighter, and then he kind of adapted and became really defensively one of the best fighters there's ever been, if not the best. So it's not easy, but it can be done, and we've seen Fury doing something in the second two Wilder fights that we'd never seen before. But who knows if he's going to carry that game plan out in this fight. He says he will. He says he's going to meet Dillian Whyte in the centre of the ring, but he says a lot, Fury, doesn't he? And who knows what's going to happen.
Josh, I'm told you're armed with some stats for us to kind of break down in terms of the way that this fight could go. I noticed you don't have any paper or anything in front of you, so good luck.
It was basically about building on from what I said about Dillian Whyte's jab. I think, as I said, Deontay Wilder didn't have one really, so Dillian Whyte has to be punch perfect in that respect. And to be fair to him, he does throw a lot of jabs. I think I was looking into CompuBox numbers, and only Alexander Usyk throws more jabs per round of all heavyweights in the division than Dillian Whyte. So you're not asking him to do something that he's never done before. He knows how to jab, and he'll try and do it frequently. It's just whether he can pick the right moments at the right times to try and destabilise Fury and break his rhythm. But then on the flip side of that, I was looking into what heavyweights take the most power punches from their opponents, and it's Dillian Whyte. Of all heavyweights, he takes the most power punches. So if you're thinking about the size difference and how big Tyson Fury is, the style he's now adopted, I think that's quite dangerous for Whyte.
Absolutely. You know, we've spoken here about how Whyte can trouble Fury. We've spoken about how Fury has changed his style. You know, looking at the odds and things like that, the overwhelming likelihood here is that Fury does win this fight. It's just how he's going to do it and how that looks. If you were to predict how this fight is going to look stylistically and how Fury would win, what would you reckon would be the most likely way?
I think Fury, either points or maybe a late stoppage. And I think another issue with Dillian Whyte may be that when he exerts a lot of energy, when he has a particularly aggressive round and he's through a high output in a round or even a part of a round, he tends to then have to take a round off or have a big break, and he's relaxed and he has to take it easy and he's exhausted almost, it looks at times, and then he comes back and he gets a second wind. I think that when he does that in this fight, then Fury will be able to exploit that and take full advantage. And if I was a betting man, I would put my money on Fury to win by late stoppage rather than points.
Well, we're going to call in our resident tipster fairly soon, so you can pick apart his tips in a second. What about you in terms of the way the fight's going to unfold? You know, for those people who watch the Wilder fights and thinks that Fury's going to come out swinging again, do you reckon it's worth urging some caution in terms of that being a repeat event?
I think we might see a bit more caution from Fury early on. I think because he should expect that Whyte has more about him, as Carl said earlier in the show. Wilder looked for one punch and one punch only really throughout the whole fight, whereas Whyte has got more about him. He can build attacks. He can give Fury different looks. So I would expect Fury to be a bit more cautious to start with, but I agree with Carl that a late stoppage would probably be my pick.
And Josh said it's never boring with Tyson Fury in or outside of the ring, and there have been some kind of behind the scenes problems as well. Do you think that could come into effect in terms of affecting the way this fight goes?
I don't know. I guess it depends how badly or how close both fighters have been to the problems. I'd assume they would let their lawyers deal with it all and they can concentrate on the camp. But I'd be interested to know from you, Carl, because obviously you had some issues while you were fighting. Did that ever affect your preparations? Or?
No, not necessarily. And I think that, I suppose each fighter is going to be different, but I just don't. I feel like Fury is someone who doesn't really care that much. Dillian Whyte, I think, is fully focused on winning the. There's some talk that Dillian Whyte's not going to show up and all that. It's nonsense, really. The fight will happen. There's too much money on the table for him not to show up. And when he shows up, he will try his best to win. And he's been away training behind the scenes. I think both fighters will be mentally prepared for it. I think that Dillian Whyte, although I would like to have seen him be a bit more involved in the press conference and build the fight. I'm like most boxing fans. I enjoy the kind of theatrics before a fight, but I think he's played a bit of in terms of trying to get into Tyson's head. Not saying he's definitely get into his head, but Fury would have got into his head if he'd have been more involved in the fight, and he's just kept quiet. I think he's played his cards really well.
And no denying what top billing is on Saturday, the 23rd of April, St George's Day, Fury against Whyte at Wembley. But there is, of course, an undercard as well. Not a classic undercard, it's fair to say. Josh, anyone we should be looking out for on the undercard here?
I think listening to what Frank Warren's been saying, I think he's quite unlucky in terms of the fighters that he's got that he wanted to put on the card. I think he even said himself he didn't want to really throw them in there because they've got bigger things in the pipeline. I think Anthony Yard's waiting for another shot at the world title. Obviously Joe Joyce, he said, has got a broken wrist, I think he said. But yeah, I think Isaac Lowe, his fight is probably the best one on there. I think obviously Tommy Fury is probably going to get the most headlines, but I guess I don't know too much about his opponent, but I would assume it's not like a dangerous fight for him. But yeah, I guess in these sort of fights, people will moan about the undercard, but really they're just tuning in for the big fight. If no one's not going to watch the fight because the undercard's rubbish.
Yeah, absolutely. And you say you don't know much about his opponent. Tommy Fury himself said, "This man I'm about to fight would iron Jake Paul out easy." So there's some context for you. Anything to comment on Tommy?
I think that, well, the undercard as a whole, I think that when you have to pay so much money for the top fight, the top billing fight, then there's not a lot of money to spare for what's going on underneath. And I think when we think about that rationally, I think the undercard's actually okay, but the amount of money that's been spent in this fight is huge. It's broken all records in terms of a purse for a boxing event, and I think Anthony Kakachi against Jonathan Romero, a former world champion, both guys have only one defeat on the record each. I think that's a good fight as chief support. Ball and Lowe isn't a bad fight either. I think it could be quite an exciting fight, but just because these guys aren't a household name, I understand why people are disappointed, but they have to understand that all the money really has been spent on the big fight, and like you said, everybody's tuning in to see Tyson Fury against Dillian Whyte.
I think as well, when sometimes on these undercards, like on Anthony Joshua undercards, you might see like a Callum Smith out, and these guys are big names, but usually the people they face aren't up to much. So it's just because there's a big name doesn't mean that it's going to be a good fight. So I think that's probably important for people to remember as well.
There you have it. Going to be some exciting fights on the undercard as well. We've done a preview of the fight itself. It's now time to call in our resident tipster to give us his thoughts ahead of the big evening on Saturday the 23rd. Yeah, welcome to Oddschecker's boxing tipster here, Pete Morris as well, who's joined us to share 3 tips, is it? Or maybe 4, maybe a bonus at the end as well. What's the main fancy then? Give it to us. Parimatch offering plenty of markets. Yeah. What's the headline tip?
Well, I'm glad to say that we are all backing Fury in this one. I'm glad not stepping in here and then calling out Whyte. But the main tip will be Tyson Fury by unanimous decision, which is 11-4. I think some of the good things that you guys were talking about earlier, we've seen this new style Tyson Fury sort of seek and destroy, like you were saying. I personally wouldn't be that surprised if we saw him almost revert back to type in this fight and look to box a bit more. Physically, Whyte's a very different customer than Wilder is. Shorter, I'd say stronger in the legs, more robust, and like you said, tailor-made for a box and move sort of style. So I think I wouldn't be surprised if Fury goes that way a little bit more and we see him box a bit more. I think 11-4 for unanimous decision is a pretty good price.
Carl, could you see any possibility of the fight going the distance and it not going Fury's way?
Yeah, no, well, it's hard to see that not going Fury's way. There's a strong possibility it could go the distance, and it would not surprise me if Fury wins on points. But I feel like I just feel like a knockout may come in the second half of the fight, maybe the last sort of 4 rounds, something like that. And the reason being is I feel like Dillian Whyte, he sometimes gasses, he overexerts himself and he blows a little bit. But if it goes to points, really, really hard to see Dillian Whyte winning on points.
It's good that you say that because, for those watching who agree more with what Carl Frampton's saying rather than Oddschecker's Peter Morris, you've got a second tip coming up as well in a second.
Yeah, I'm out of something for you, Carl.
But before we go into that, I should say that Parimatch are offering exact method markets that split out unanimous majority and split decision results, which isn't always the way, and it means that bettors are getting better value there. And 11-4, the tip for the first one, an implied 26% probability.
Can I just put a disclaimer out that I very rarely get them right, so
don't say that.
Don't listen to me.
We're in the bookie, Carl. But if you do, despite that disclaimer from Carl there, if you do want to side with a former world champion rather than a guy who's never spent any time in a ring before, then what's...
Forward twice.
Sorry.
I've got 2 months under my belt.
What is the second tip?
The second tip is Tyson Fury by TKO. Again, it's the exact method markets, and that's 6-4. And I think looking at the specific markets and the prices, the KO market is 11-4 and the TKO is 6-4. But the short price 6-4 I think is much better value. A TKO victory is quite unusual, and especially when you look at Tyson Fury's style, he's not a massive one-punch boxer. You look at he's got 22 stoppage victories, only 4 of them have come by KO and 18 of them by TKO. So I think that TKO market at 6-4 again offers a decent bit of value when maybe they're just overpricing that KO market a little bit. And again, going back to sort of what Carl was saying, you can definitely see Whyte getting tired in the back end of the fight. So the stoppage not necessarily being, you know, a knockout, but more of exhaustion, accumulation of punishment from the way that Fury's boxing, and even the ref stepping in. So I think that TKO again at 6-4 is a good bet if you don't fancy the distance.
Josh, just for those people who are watching this who only watch the big fights, can you explain the difference between TKO and KO?
Well, just before that, just to build on that, I think we saw that when Dillian Whyte faced Joseph Parker. If it went a round or 2 more, he was exhausted at the end of that fight, wasn't he? So I think that is probably definitely a good shout.
And the other one as a sort of model for it maybe is the Fury Chisora fight, where he really just broke Chisora apart and the ref had to step in. There was a TKO victory. And again, style-wise, Chisora is very physically a similar sort of fighter to Whyte in that he's shorter, very stocky, very physically strong, will look to try and get in his chest. So I think that sort of TKO bet could be one that if you don't fancy the decision, then yeah, 6-4 I think it's a good shot.
Yeah, 6-4 there with Parimatch TKO when the ref comes in and stops the fight. So Fury to win by that method, as you say, the way he normally does win in terms of the of that market as well, with Parimatch splitting the method of victory into 2 different markets there. Not all bookies doing that whatsoever. The third tip as well plays into what Carl was saying earlier.
Yeah, this is one a little bit of a longer price. So 6-1 for Tyson Fury to win in rounds 10-12. So basically going back to what we've said already around Whyte getting tired, accumulation of punishment. If Fury doesn't put it on him early and is looking to box him and just use his range, move his feet, I can definitely see Whyte giving him a bit of trouble during the middle rounds and really trying to close that gap and put a bit of pressure on him. But eventually, I think the skills that Fury possesses, the size of him, I think it'll get tough work for Whyte in the later part of the round, later part of the fight. And I think 6-1 in rounds 10-12 is a good bet. And probably
That's really good value.
yeah. It's the middle rounds are actually shorter prices, and I think I'd much rather bet on him to finish him late than those middle rounds. So 6-1, I think is a good bet.
That appeals to you, Carl?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, that put a gun to my head. I feel like Fury will stop him late. So 6-1 rounds 10-12 is worth a pound.
There we go. And finally, for those who do want to get against Tyson Fury and back Dillian Whyte, I know that's not the way you want to go, but you've very diplomatically gone out there and looked for.
For me, I'd keep it really simple and just bet on Whyte by stoppage. Any stoppage. I think it's 5-1. Again, not one that I'll be going after, but 5-1 Whyte stop him. I personally don't see it happening, but if you want to back him, then that's the way to go.
There you go, 5-1. It's not a tip. We're not going to call it a tip. It's just for those people out there who do want to side with Dillian Whyte for the big fight as well. Thank you very much to Pete for sharing his tips with us today.
Cheers, thank you.
Time now just to have a look at what will be the aftermath of this fight, as is always the case here. And this is obviously going to be another opportunity for Tyson Fury to really cement himself as one of the best in the game. In long term and kind of across all weights, Carl, where do you think Tyson Fury at this moment in time ranks amongst the best that Britain have ever had?
He's up there, but I wouldn't say he's the best. He's done some great things in his career. I think the 3 fights against Wilder, although one was a draw officially. He won that fight.
Yeah.
They're big achievements, but going away to Germany to beat Vladimir Klitschko, huge win when no one really expected him to do that. He's up there, but I think there's still a little bit more he needs to do to cement himself as the best ever that Britain's ever produced. And I think a couple more wins after a Dillian Whyte victory, if he does win, for example, Usyk and AJ's next 2 fights, then it's hard to say that he wasn't the best ever. If he wins them fights, if they ever happen, and he retires undefeated, what a career he's already had. What a career that would be if it finishes like that.
Do you think that will happen?
Who knows? He says he's going to retire after this fight.
Do you believe that?
He seemed sincere and like he was being honest. And he mentioned the money, and he said, "Look, after this fight, I'll have over 100 million in the bank, a lot of money." And
that was when you retired, wasn't it? When you hit 100 million in the
yeah,
bank?
well, I wish. But he's got a family. He's away from his kids. He's missed a lot of his kids growing up and stuff. So, would it surprise me if he retired? Yes, it would. While the AJ fight's still being talked about, while there's a potential to become undisputed against the winner of AJ and Usyk, I think it would surprise me that if we never see him in a boxing ring again. But he talked about a crossover fight with Francis Ngannou, which would be a huge attraction in itself. He's talked about WWE again, which is massive for some people, not so much for me. But yeah, I feel like we'll see him again.
Surely it's not a massive price that he retires and then comes back again afterwards. I mean,
we may see that. Yeah, you know, you've seen fighters do that in the past, retire but then come back.
He's half done it.
It's almost and it's almost like, you know, I'll retire now because I want more money to come back.
Yeah.
One of them ones. Maybe he's just being clever. Who knows?
Josh, where do you think Fury ranks, and what do you think he has to do in order to really cement himself as maybe the best?
I guess you're kind of looking at Joe Calzaghe at the moment, 46 wins in 46 fights. Lennox Lewis, obviously the last guy to be undisputed at heavyweight. I think if Tyson Fury can end his career, as Carl said, with the win over Whyte and then becoming undisputed against either Usyk or AJ, I think it's hard to argue against that sort of resume and that sort of career. So I think he has to, as Carl said, have a few more fights and then he'll be definitely in the conversation of those 2 guys.
If he were to win, Josh, as we expect him to do here, as we've spoken about for the last half an hour or so, and he were to fight Usyk and then AJ, would you make him kind of heavy favourite in both of those fights going into it?
I would, yeah. I'd make it. I think what we all expected from AJ against Usyk was for him to use his physical advantages, which obviously he didn't. And I think Fury has already shown with Wilder that he's more than capable of doing that. So I think, not that Usyk isn't good enough, I just think the size differences there, are so great that I think Fury would take control. I think probably AJ has more of a chance to beat Fury than
I'd agree with that.
than Usyk, just because AJ is a big guy, and unlike Wilder, he can set his punches up. He's a good boxer. He didn't look good against Usyk, but he is a good boxer. He's technically sound in that respect, and I think he doesn't have the one-punch knockout power like Wilder, but he's got repeated power, and he would know if he would put Fury down, and I think he would also be able to keep putting him down as well.
Do you agree with that? You think Joshua is the one who could beat him?
I think he's a better chance of beating him than Usyk, although Usyk is an unbelievable fighter, one of my favourites. Technically, probably better than both Fury and AJ. Definitely technically better than AJ, but size really matters when it's the big men, and I think that would just be a step too far for Usyk. I think that Fury is just too big for him, and that would really be the difference. But I would agree with Josh here that I think that AJ has more of a chance of beating Fury than Usyk, although he's not as good as a fighter as him. But he's an athlete. He's a real strong powerhouse when he wants to be. He got the tactics really wrong against Usyk, but I'm sure if he fought Fury, the tactics would be different, and he knows he would have to get on him and try, and he's not going to outbox him. He would have to knock him out, and that's the tactics I expect to see in the next fight with Usyk as well. He's not going to outbox him. He has to go forward and try and knock him out and impose his strength.
Were you surprised by how that Usyk-Joshua fight went?
Yeah, I was surprised. I think most people in boxing were surprised. It was bizarre from the outside looking in, the tactics. You're trying to outbox the master boxer when you've got so many more physical attributes. He should have been on him. He should have been. All he had to do was be a brute in that fight and impose his strength and size and throw him around, throw Usyk around and push him down. Do a bit of a kind of Vladimir Klitschko style, hit, push down, hold, push down, and just sap their energy. But he stood off and he got outboxed. He knows for the next fight the tactics certainly have to change. and hopefully we see it. I think a lot of people just have Usyk winning that fight comfortably. I'm not so sure. If AJ gets it right, he can win that fight. And obviously, look, Usyk has a lot of other things to worry about at the minute, a lot more on his plate. That's got to be playing on his mind, although he's getting ready for the fight.
Yeah.
It kind of just puts boxing into perspective, really. And he's things on his mind at the minute, which may affect his build-up to a fight.
For a boxer in AJ whose star has rose so quickly and the trajectory kept going upwards, do you think having that defeat and having been brought back to earth with such a bump can actually be a positive in terms of going forward and learning from those mistakes?
I'm not so sure. He had that moment against Andy Ruiz, and he was kind of able to settle the score in the second fight, and he won the second fight quite comfortably on points. But he's a marquee name. He's a huge name, probably the biggest name in British sports still. Always had 2 defeats on his record. He's a media darling. Like, everybody loves him. Your granny loves him. The young girl on the street loves him. He's just a huge name. But I think that he didn't. I don't think it done him. I don't think didn't need to lose that fight to bring him back.
Was complacency, and this was just being found out.
I think so. Yeah.
Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I just think AJ's biggest problem has been inactivity. I think because he achieved so much so early on. He went from going to like a 2-fighter a year sort of boxer really too quickly. I think he's still learning. He's still trying to find his way. And I think only fighting once a year just doesn't really help that. And obviously in the caliber of opponents he's going up against.
Do we think, this is to both of you just before we close, do we think we will see the Fury AJ fight?
Yes, I do. I think there's even whatever happens, and say for example, Dillian Whyte beat Fury and Usyk beat AJ. Fury and AJ is still a huge fight. Yeah. It's still a massive fight, and I just believe it will happen at some point before both of them hang them up. I think it's got to happen. There's too much money involved.
I just hope that politics and egos don't get in the way in the build-up. But yeah, I agree. I think we can still see that.
Let's hope it's not in 10 years' time, though. Thank you very much to both Josh and to Carl for joining us today and sharing their thoughts on the Fury-Whyte fight coming on the 23rd of April at Wembley Stadium. Thank you very much to Parimatch as well for sponsoring the show. Remember, for new customers only, £1 max stake, 30-1 on Fury, 70-1 on Whyte. Those to be paid out in free bets, 18+ only. Be gamble aware, and please do gamble responsibly. Hopefully the fight will live up to the billing. Hopefully a couple of winners in there as well. But some absolutely fantastic insight from both the guys as well. So do enjoy the fight, and as ever, please do gamble responsibly.